Good afternoon to all of you. I am delighted to be here this afternoon. Thank you very much to Dean Rodriguez, Dean Amon, who I had the privilege of having lunch with, the Women's Law Students Association, and my dear friend, Professor West, who encouraged me to come and provided that gracious introduction. It is truly an honor to be part of this esteemed lecture series. According to Google, which as you know is the font of all knowledge, the Edith House Lecture Series provides a speaking forum for, quote, outstanding female legal scholars and practitioners. Well, I've got the female part covered, but as a judge, I am certainly no scholar. And I thought I would actually steer clear of academic subjects this afternoon and talk instead about something I'm often asked about, which is my background, my path to the bench, and work-life balance issues. I hope that these comments, which I offer in the spirit of National Women's History Month, will interest at least some of you, which I suppose is the best that any judge can hope for when giving a speech, as Justice Samuel Alito recently observed. Some of you may have read that story about a year ago in the ABA Journal magazine, in which Justice Alito is quoted recounting a conversation that he had with his wife after the two of them attended a speech that was given by another judge. Apparently, Justice Alito and his wife got into their car at the conclusion of the speech, and his wife said, "You know, that was a very boring speech." Justice Alito agreed, and then he attempted to explain to his wife why he thought that was so. He suggested that due to all of the confidentiality concerns related to their work, judges are really constrained. They can't talk about what they've done, and they can't talk about what they're going to do, so he reasoned that makes it very difficult for them to give an interesting speech. Well, Justice Alito's wife took that all in for a moment and then responded, "No, judges are just very boring people." Well, at the risk of fitting that bill today, this speech is about my upbringing and career, and perhaps most importantly, it's about how I've managed to keep it all together as a judge in the federal trial system who moonlights as the mother of two daughters, one who is 12 but thinks she's 21, and the other who just turned 16 this past January and is in the full throes of teenagerdom. Now, most of you are too young to have teenagers yourselves, but you've been there, and so you can imagine what I mean. One moment you have this beautiful, sweet baby, and then suddenly, as if out of nowhere, you look around and she's taller than you are and absolutely certain that she knows more than you do about everything. Right now, in fact, I am in that peculiar stage of life when I experience near daily whiplash from the jarring juxtaposition of my two most significant roles, United States District Judge on the one hand, and mother of teenage daughters on the other. During the workday, I am a federal judge, which means people generally treat me with respect. I have people who work for me in my chambers. Litigants look up to me to give them answers to complex legal questions. I control what happens in my courtroom. When I say things, people listen, and they generally do what I tell them to do. But in the evenings, when I leave the courthouse and go home, in the course of that transition, all of my wisdom and knowledge and authority evaporates. My daughters make it very clear that as far as they're concerned, I know nothing. I should not tell them anything, much less give them any orders. That is, if they talk to me at all. But I try not to get discouraged. I choose to believe that somewhere, deep down, they appreciate this journey that we're on together, and it's that abiding hope that led me to an interesting thought experiment when I was preparing for this speech. My relationship with my two precocious teenagers became the framing, if you will, for what I hope will be an interesting, or at least not entirely boring, presentation. You see, I wondered, what if my two worlds collided for just a little time, and my daughters were called upon to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about their mother's life and career and the practical advice that she had given them thus far? assuming, of course, that we could get beyond the heavy sighing and the eye rolling and their natural impulse to reject any suggestion that I make. What if my daughters were called to the stand as character witnesses to talk about their mother? I wondered, what would they say? I think they'd likely begin with my personal background. Layla, my 12-year-old, would explain that I was born in Washington, D.C. in 1970 to two public school teachers at the time. My parents had both been raised in Miami, Florida, which I'm honored to hear that Edith House spent time there as well. And they came to D.C. to start their married lives and careers as so many people do. In the early 1970s, my parents had just emerged along with the rest of the country from the dramatic reshaping of law and society known as the Civil Rights Movement, and they decided to express their pride in my family's African ancestry by asking my aunt, who was in the Peace Corps in Africa at the time, to send a list of African girl names for their consideration. They selected the name Ketanji Onyeka, which they were told was translated into lovely one, and for the first 26 years of my life, I was known as Ketanji Onyeka Brown. Now, at this point in my daughter's testimony, Talia, my 16-year-old, would certainly jump in to correct any impression that her sister may have left about my upbringing, pointing out that it is not entirely accurate to suggest that I'm a DC native, because when I was 3 years old, my parents and I moved to Miami, Florida, and I was actually raised there. In fact, my earliest memories are of our apartment in the married students' housing complex on the University of Miami, where my father had returned to go to law school. And even now, when people ask me why I decided to go into the legal profession, I often tell the story of how when I was in preschool, I would sit at the dining room table doing my homework with my father. He had all of his law books stacked up, and I had all of my coloring books stacked up. And when I think back to those times, there really is no question that my interest in the law began that early on. Now, at this point, Layla, my impatient one, would jump in and insist that we fast forward past what was, by all accounts, a terrific but normal childhood. My father got his law degree, and he worked in-house in several businesses, and then became the principal attorney for the Dade County School Board. My mom rose through the ranks in the public school systems in Miami, starting as a middle school science teacher and then becoming a high school assistant principal, and she eventually served 14 years as the principal of Miami's premier public magnet school for the arts. I had a close extended family in the greater Miami area, lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, and I got to spend time with my beloved grandparents who worked very hard to ensure that their children and grandchildren got education and opportunities that they never had. When I was growing up, my parents and I lived in a predominantly Jewish suburb of South Miami, and I went to a very good public school that gave me a strong educational foundation. And between all the bar and bat mitzvahs, I got involved in student government and was elected the president of my very large public high school, 800 students strong, go Panthers. But my primary extracurricular activity was speech and debate, which is sometimes called forensics, and that was an experience that I can say without hesitation was the one activity that best prepared me for future success in law and in life. Under the tutelage of an extraordinary woman named Fran Berger, who was my coach and my mentor, I learned how to reason and how to write, and I gained the self-confidence that can sometimes be quite difficult for women and minorities to develop at an early age. I have no doubt that of all of the various things that I've done, it was my high school experience as a competitive speaker that taught me how to lean in despite the obstacles, to stand firm in the face of challenges, to work hard, to be resilient, to strive for excellence, and to believe that anything is possible. Competitive speech and debate was also the experience that literally paved the way for me to go to college. Our debate team traveled a fair amount to various meets and competitions nationally, mostly within Florida, but we did go to a debate tournament every year at Harvard in February. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Cambridge, Massachusetts in February, but I can tell you firsthand that being there at that time of the year is not easy for a Miami girl. But I loved it. I loved everything about it. And when I applied to Harvard College and got in, I knew there was no place that I would rather go. I matriculated there in 1988 and continued as an undergraduate student there through 1992, despite the unbearable winters. And it was unquestionably the right place for me. I had fabulous friends, took challenging courses, and participated in a wide range of interesting extracurricular activities, including drama and musical theater, during which I made several notable connections, the most prominent of which I suppose is Matt Damon, who was assigned to be my scene partner during a drama course we took one semester. As a side note, although I was pretty good, I doubt he'd remember me now. In any event, while at Harvard, I also met and dated my serious boyfriend, who later became my husband and to whom I have been married happily for 20 years. It's interesting because my husband Patrick is the quintessential Boston Brahmin. His family can be traced back to England before the Mayflower, and his family's been in Massachusetts for centuries. He and his twin brother are, in fact, sixth generation Harvard. By contrast, I am only the second generation in my family to go to any college, and I'm fairly certain that if you traced my family back past my grandparents, who were raised in Georgia, by the way, you would find that my ancestors were slaves on both sides. In addition, my husband was pre-med and math, and I was a full-on government major, so we were an unlikely pair in many respects. But somehow we found each other, and we dated continuously for 6.5 years through the end of college and the entirety of his Columbia Medical School experience and my Harvard Law School experience before we got married in 1996. Now, as you'll remember, I am telling this story through the eyes of my daughter, and I'm very certain that Talia would break in and announce at this point that her sister Layla had been going on way too long, and that it was her turn to say something about my career as a lawyer. I don't recall this same dynamic between me and my brother. I have only one brother who's 9 years younger than I am, but my daughters compete for attention when they're not ignoring us. And at this point in my fantasy testimony scenario, Talia would grab the microphone from her sister and start talking vigorously about my career, starting with my work in several law firms during and after the 3 federal clerkships that I had the privilege of undertaking. I always knew that I was interested in criminal law, but as a newlywed, I also realized that I needed to pay the rent and bills and law school loans, so I did what many young lawyers do. I joined a law firm. In my case, it was a series of law firms. In 1998, fresh off my clerkship from working with the Honorable Patty Saris on the District of Massachusetts, as Professor West mentioned, and Bruce Selya on the First Circuit, I took a job as an associate at a phenomenal white-collar boutique law firm in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure I would have stayed there much longer than the 9 months that I actually worked there had it not been for the incredible opportunity to clerk for Associate Justice Stephen Breyer. All 3 of my clerkships were very different and very interesting, but being on the Supreme Court was amazing. And even today, I feel so lucky to have had the chance to work inside an institution that has such a significant impact on the lives of Americans and that few people even get to see, much less to be a part of. After my time on the Supreme Court, I would have loved to have stayed in DC to launch my career, but in the professional give and take that is often required of newlyweds, I thought it best to accompany my husband back up to Boston for the completion of his surgical residency, primarily because at that point I was 3 months pregnant. And so for me began the delicate balancing that so many young lawyers face in their professional lives. How does one manage the demands of your career and also the needs of your family? When we returned to the Boston area, I took a position as a general litigation associate in a very large law firm, Goodwin Procter. And like many young women who enter big law, I soon found it extremely challenging to combine law firm work with my life as a wife and a mother. Talia was born a few months after I started working at Goodwin, and the firm was very supportive, but I don't think it is possible to overstate the degree of difficulty that many young women, and especially new mothers, face in the law firm context. The hours are long, The workflow is unpredictable. You have little control over your time and your schedule. And you start to feel as though the demands of the billable hour are constantly in conflict with the needs of your children and your family responsibilities. I do want to be clear, though, this is not an indictment of Goodwin Procter. It's a great law firm. It just seems that the nature of big firm law practice is difficult to manage when you have a family, no matter how nice the firm's partners might be. There are many women who can make it work. Some are quite well suited to the pressures of law firms. I discovered early on that I was not. And unfortunately, researchers have established that I'm not alone. A recent report published by the National Association of Women Lawyers studied women's experiences in large law firms, and the statistics are bleak. For example, the NAWL survey found that while 50% of the graduates of law schools each year for the past 15 years have been women, only about 15% of law firm equity partners and chief legal officers have been women, despite substantial recruitment efforts by law firms over the past 2 decades. Drilling down even further, the survey authors announced that virtually no progress has been made by the nation's largest firms in the past 10 years in advancing minority partners, and particularly minority women partners, into the highest ranks of firms. And indeed, the few minority women who advance continue to play the role of pioneers because lawyers of color, male and female, constitute only 8% of law firm equity partners nationwide. Putting these statistics into context, the report notes that in a typical large law firm, say one that consists of 129 equity partners, there would be 105 white male partners, 7 minority male partners, 20 white female partners, and only 2 minority female partners. Now, I suppose that these statistics are not all that surprising when one considers research that has been done about the experience of minority women in big law firms. The cover story of the March 2016 edition of the ABA Journal featured one such story and study, and the story was entitled "Invisible Then Gone." According to the ABA, in many law firm environments, minority women lawyers are often left alone without mentorship to idle and stagnant practices. As a result, some feel excluded from the centers of power and influence within the firm, and the report also noted that a whopping 85% of minority female attorneys in the United States will quit large law firms within 7 years of starting their practice. Other reports have highlighted additional factors that may be contributing to the dissatisfaction of many women in the context of a law firm. For example, the NAWL report notes that the typical female equity partner earns only 80% of what the typical male equity partner earns. Similarly, although the data suggests that the total hours that women equity partners work actually exceed those of their male counterparts, there are significant disparities in the client billables due to committee assignments, hourly billing rates, and the distribution of pro bono hours, such that the typical woman equity partner ends up billing only 78% of what a typical male equity partner bills. There are apparently also barriers to the advancement of women at lower levels of a firm. Issues such as the lack of top-tier women to serve as role models and mentors, and firm cultures that can isolate women associates, and especially those who negotiate part-time or reduced hours schedules. According to scholars who study retention rates, all this might help to explain why large numbers of women move away from big firm practice each year. And at the very least, it suggests that women may be turning elsewhere for greater professional fulfillment. In my case, it was the inflexibility of the work schedules and assignments that became the deal breaker as I struggled with being a young mother in the context of a firm. That period of my life taught me some very hard lessons, but also important ones. I learned that as much as I enjoyed developing trial practice skills in law school, and in my mind I had many Perry Mason moments, If I was going to make my life work as a lawyer and also have a family, I needed to use my legal skills in a more predictable, more controllable environment. That was a realization for me, the understanding that if I was going to leave my baby and go to work outside the home, I needed to find a law job that was not only fulfilling, but was also compatible with the needs of my family. And armed with that realization, I then began what can only be characterized as a professional odyssey of epic proportions. As anyone who knows me can tell you, there were a number of years in which I literally moved from job to job to job. I guess you can say I was something of a professional vagabond, moving from place to place as my family needs and circumstances changed. There were times when we lived in Boston and times when we lived in DC. There were times when I went into government. For example, I worked on the staff of the United States Sentencing Commission and later as an assistant federal public defender in DC. And there were times when, primarily for financial reasons, I would go back into private practice. But I did so at a more senior level than in the early days, and by that time I had become an appellate lawyer rather than a trial lawyer, which meant that I had discrete, manageable projects that could be handled without a lot of travel, and I worked with the same core group of great people, so there were few, if any, surprises. In fact, by 2007, I thought I had finally nailed it. The perfect combination. I was doing challenging and interesting work as of counsel in the DC-based Supreme Court and appellate practice of a wonderful California firm called Morrison & Foerster. Their nickname is MoFo. Being a MoFo lawyer meant that I could support my family financially, and by doing appeals and opting out of the partnership track, I still had some control over my schedule. And I was at MoFo for a little more than 2.5 years, perfectly content, when my circumstances seemed to get even better. In 2009, the White House called, and I got the chance to be considered for nomination to a full-time seat on the United States Sentencing Commission, which is the judicial branch agency that develops federal sentencing policy. And it was the same agency that I had worked in as a staffer just a few years before. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, this for me was an opportunity of a lifetime, and it was well worth enduring what I can only say was the extremely nerve-wracking nomination and confirmation process. I actually taught myself to knit as a way to channel my nervous energy during that time. If anybody wants a scarf, I'm your source. Many yarn skeins later, in February of 2010, the Senate confirmed me, and the president appointed me as vice chair of the commission. And I was back working in the agency that I had previously been a part of among extraordinarily talented and committed people, which, as I said, in this agency is an independent, bipartisan agency in the judicial branch. Being on the commission also paved the way for me to be considered for an appointment as a U.S. district judge. That appointment process for me began in the early winter of 2012. I spent most of the winter, spring, and summer in the vetting process, and President Obama formally nominated me in September of 2012, which was a mere 2 months before the presidential election that would determine whether or not I would actually be able to take the bench. Now, to the extent that Talia has been guiding the testimony regarding the course of my career thus far, Layla would take over at this point, and to make sure that you fully comprehend how stressful it was for me to be given a shot at my dream job, being a federal judge, but to have my chances of actually getting that job hinge on circumstances that were completely out of my control, specifically whether or not the country voted to re-elect President Obama. And when you add to this fact that I am related by marriage to House Speaker Paul Ryan, who was at that point running for vice president against President Obama, you can get the sense of what that period of time was like for me. And if you didn't, Layla would make sure of that. She would recall, for example, that I was unusually jumpy and started so many scarves that I could have outfitted a small army. Well, I'm happy to report that all's well that ends well. I was confirmed by the Senate in March of 2013, and I was able to take a seat among the fabulous judges on the district court bench that spring. And I can say with confidence, now 4 years later, that I really love this job. I'm very busy with a number of complex cases, but also very satisfied with my work and my life. I guess you could say that my center of gravity on the work-life balance continuum has actually shifted. I now probably work even longer hours than I did at the firm, but not because I'm billing time. Instead, it's because I care deeply about reaching the right result and doing my best to render reasoned rulings for the benefit of the people who come before me. And having finally found work that suits me, work that's challenging and interesting and that I care about enormously, I hope that I am finally able to provide a good role model for my daughters. And I try to give them useful advice about my own experiences and based on my own experiences. I would be interested to hear what my daughter's testimony would be. If they were called as a character witness, I'm pretty sure that Layla, my younger, would give me a positive review. And if you could get Talia to look up from her iPad for a moment, she would no doubt have a one-word answer to the question of what she thinks about her mother. Good. But if pressed, she might go on to describe certain things that I've told her over the years about how to be and what to do. For example, Talia might say that both of her parents tell her to work hard at everything she's called upon to do. That is, give it your best effort, whether it's a homework assignment or a basketball game or a household chore. She would admit that the indomitable spirit of hard work is a shared value that united her parents right from the beginning, long before she was born, and sustains them in their personal and professional lives even today. Patrick and I are, in fact, those long-suffering, early-to-bed, early-to-rise kind of people. And in our family, we have a mantra that emphasizes prioritization of work over play as one of our first principles. As the girls would testify, do what you need to do before what you want to do is a constant refrain in our house. Talia might also say that her parents require and exhibit respect for other people, anyone and everyone, no matter who they are or what they do. I think of it this way. I feel so fortunate to have had the opportunities that I have had in life. I believe it's my obligation to teach my children to refrain from casting aspersions on others because of their life circumstances. In other words, as they often say in religious circles, I know that there, but for the grace of God, go I. I teach my children that this means that we approach the world with a grateful spirit. We don't look down on or talk down to others, and we show respect for all mankind. Layla would probably hasten to add that her parents instruct her to keep an open mind, to be open to new ideas and experiences, because you never know when someone else will have an interesting thought, or when a new door will open that takes you on the journey of your dreams. And finally, both of my daughters might emphasize that their mother is always telling them to look for mentors and role models in each new situation they encounter, someone who can look out for them and help them to navigate the challenges that lie ahead in whatever field they choose to go into. For me, many of the women and men I've been privileged to know throughout my life have served that function. My mother, my grandmother, my aunt, certain teachers, special coaches, and the judges for whom I clerked, as well as many of those with whom I now work. There are also women I've never met, but who are recorded in the pages of history and whose lives and struggles inspire me and thousands of other working women to keep putting one foot in front of the other every day. Women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Belva Lockwood, Susan B. Anthony, Constance Baker Motley, Amelia Earhart, Marie Curie, Indira Gandhi, Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Learning about these and other historical figures, and also having the privilege of working with strong women role models, has been essential to my career development and is crucial to the development and advancement of girls like my daughters, who need to learn that they have opportunities in America today, opportunities that don't exist for girls in many other countries, largely because so many committed women from generations past and present have done the heavy lifting to pave the way and open the doors for us and for those who will come after. I want to end this trip down memory lane, as told through the imagined testimony of my daughters, with a relatively recent real-life testimony that came up in an interesting context and in a manner that, for the first time in a long time, made me feel like those sassy sisters really do know who I am and what I do. As you all well know, last year a tremendously influential and extraordinary jurist, Justice Antonin Scalia, passed away unexpectedly, and the Obama administration undertook the process of evaluating potential candidates for appointment to the Supreme Court. This was certainly a dramatic turn of events for our country, especially in the midst of a presidential election cycle, and it captivated the attention of most people in the legal community. But my husband and I thought that our teenage daughters were totally oblivious to the Supreme Court and its politics and the process of nominating justices. Well, it became clear that we were wrong when my youngest daughter came to us, maybe about 3 weeks or so after Justice Scalia passed, and asked us very earnestly whether we had heard that Justice Scalia had died and there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court. We assured her that we had, and she said that some of her middle school friends had been talking, and they said to her, you know, your mom's a judge. She should really apply for that position. Now, Layla thought that was a pretty good idea, and so she had come to tell me that I should submit an application for the open Supreme Court seat. Well, Patrick and I explained to her that getting to be on the Supreme Court isn't really the kind of job that you apply for. You just have to be lucky enough to have the president find you among the thousands of people who might want to do that job. To which Layla responded, well, if the president has to find you, I'm going to write him a letter to tell him who you are. She trotted off, and she came back a little while later with the following handwritten note. Dear Mr. President, while you are considering judges to fill Justice Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court, I would like to add my mother, Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District Court, to the list. I, her daughter, Layla Jackson, of 11 years old, strongly believe that she would be an excellent fit for the position. She is determined, honest, and never breaks a promise to anyone, even if there are other things she'd rather do. She can demonstrate commitment and is loyal and never brags. I think she would make a great Supreme Court justice, even if the workload will be larger on the court or if you have other nominees. Please consider her aspects for the job. Thank you for listening. Layla Jackson. Well, it is difficult to put into words how it felt to get such a ringing endorsement from my own daughter. It was an actual testimony that was by far more meaningful than any make-believe account of how my daughters feel. In that moment, I realized not only that I'm raising an assertive young woman who isn't afraid to speak her mind, even to the President of the United States, but also that my daughters are not oblivious to my work and are proud of me as I am of them and our entire family. It has been a lot of hard work trying to balance work and motherhood, and like so many other people, I often feel as if I'm failing in both arenas. But in that one brief shining moment, as I read Layla's letter, I got a glimpse of my professional and personal life combined. And what I saw made me feel as if my husband and I are well on our way to achieving success in both worlds. It has been a pleasure to be here speaking with you today. Thank you for listening.